Okay, so we're going to talk about synesthesia, and I'm going to be throwing some Greek terms around, but I'll give you, definitions of them. This won't presume any sort of background knowledge on your part. If you go to Wikipedia and you look up synesthesia, you're going to be a little bit disappointed, in part because the only thing that it brings up is a pathological condition, and they give this as the definition for that pathological condition. It's where people can't turn it off. So they look at numbers and it evokes sounds or colors or smells or things like that. And why does that happen? There's certain things that you could take that would also promote that. Certain drugs. Sometimes people get damaged in the brain and that happens to them. The reason that it happens, at least what we're going to look at with Aristotle and with Merleau-Ponty, is because it's actually part of what's going on with our normal experience. We just don't realize it. And what you guys have been asked to do by Professor Shaka is to think about how things connect up together, how tastes and smells and sounds and even larger units of meaning like music can evoke each other, can promote each other. So this definition that they give, that I put right off the bat, from Wikipedia, it's not bad, but it's a little restrictive. Perceptual experience, so it's about perception. You guys all experience things all the time. Not all of your experience is necessarily perceptual. When you have that aha moment because you solved a difficult problem, that's not perception, that's intellect, right? When you're planning out what you're going to do in the kitchen next, that's anticipation, that's not perception either. Memory is based on perception, but it's not exactly the same thing, right? So perceptual experience in which a stimulus in one modality, and what you asked what a modality is, it's one way, or one manner in which things get to us. So if we're thinking about perception, normally we think in terms of, 5 senses? Although that's a little inexact because touch covers pressure and heat and cold and all this other stuff. So maybe we have to talk about more if we want to be more exact about it. But we have different modes. So like right now I'm looking at you, I see the white of your chef's coat, the black of your hair, the gray of the Sharpie. Those are things that are coming to me through the mode of sight. We're hearing this weird noise. Somebody's moving something around. We can't see them, but we can hear them, right? That's another mode. So, now imagine what's going on upstairs. You can't actually see it, but you can kind of see it in your mind's eye. You're already doing something like this. What color is the shirt of the guy who's moving stuff around it?
Black, blue.
Yeah, who knows, right? But you're imagining something, right?
And what really messes you up is that I thought we were on the top floor.
Oh.
There's another staircase that goes up. I don't know where it goes.
There you go.
Mind blown.
Yeah. Our sense of spatiality is connected with our senses as well. So now one modality gives rise to experience in different sensory. So somebody says chocolate to you, and it's a word. You're hearing it, and suddenly you taste chocolate. Like if you have a really active imagination, or if you can't turn it off, then this could be that pathological condition. We're not so concerned with that. We're interested more in how can you make this work for you? How can you cultivate synesthetic understanding of things, synesthetic imagination? Because you're going to be chefs and you're going to be trying to think about what it is that you're making, and you're also going to try to be able to articulate to other people, to explain it to other people in language. Not just putting it in front of them and saying, here you go, eat, right? There's more to being a chef than just making good food. It has to do with your imagination. It has to do with your intellect. It has to do with your ability to communicate. It has to do with all those sorts of things. But you're communicating largely about perception, about senses. So I've got these other words here, and I want to kind of expand it a little bit. Notice that I'm not just talking about stimulus and sensory modalities. I'm using a bigger word here of meaning. Meaning is not just things like black or fast or slow, when it comes to sound, or bitter or sweet. Meaning is broader than that. It comprises more. And I'll show you, in a few minutes how Aristotle and Merleau-Ponty think about that. But look at these words. When you transfer sense. So when you guys are thinking about a dish, and let's say you're doing an exercise like what you did here today, but you're doing it the other way around. Instead of having a piece of music that evokes something for you, you want to create a dish, and you want that dish to communicate something to the person who's eating it. Like some of you talked about home. What is it about a particular dish? And let's assume that we're all on the same page with what constitutes home and comfort food. I know we're not because different cultures and things like that. But let's just say we are for the most part. You could ask yourself, okay, what could I do that would communicate, that would have meaning of home, of comfort, of settling in, of these sorts of things? What sensory impressions would I have to create? I mean, would you pick things that are super bold, lots of color and spicy peppers and things like that? I don't know. If that's your home, maybe, but not for most of us, I think. So that's stuff that you could think about. Transferring meaning from one domain to another. That's part of what you do as chefs. You may have never thought of that before, but you're transferring meaning first of all, from your imagination and your memory into actual physical things, which are going to be transferred, as kind of facetious, into people's mouths, right? Where they're going to taste things that first they were seeing and now they're tasting, and then they're going to communicate about it. And you're probably going to go to the table and say, what do you think? You like it? Not like it? What did you taste in there? Right? That's all about meaning. Sometimes there's slippage going on. You don't necessarily intend everything that goes into it. It's because meaning is generally bigger than just what we intend. Or things bleed over into each other. A dish can go wrong, right? An ambiance that you create, again, a front of the house sort of issue rather than a back of the house issue. An ambiance can actually ruin a meal, can't it? Even bad service can ruin a meal. A meal that's perfectly prepared in the back of the house, perfectly plated, everything is cooked exactly as it ought to be. It can come up there and some sort of meaning can bleed over into another meaning, can't it? And then I like this word evocation. This is another thing to think about when you're designing a dish or when you're modifying a dish. What are you trying to evoke in the person? Just like an artist who is thinking about what do they want their music to evoke in somebody else, or a painter, or an architect, how do they want people to experience space? You guys are working with perceptual experience of your clients. And of course because you're going to eat your own stuff too, right? You like eating? That's part of why you're here, I think. So you're going to do this as well. Now, Merleau-Ponty has some interesting things to say about synesthesia. And actually, I'm just going to read one passage. He's reacting against a kind of mentality that a lot of people have about how it is that our senses connect up with each other. A lot of people see it as sort of like, the senses give us units of meaning, and our brains just kind of process them and, create, something going on in there. That's not the only way that you can look at it. There's a particularly pre-modern way, and that's where a lot of your traditions of cooking come from too, from pre-modern sources, of looking at the way in which we experience things as human beings in the world, engaged with our senses, that doesn't reduce it down to just data, just to what can be measured and reproduced and perhaps, turned into something that this could experience just as much as you or I could experience. So Merleau-Ponty is talking about synesthesia, and he says, seen in the perspective of the objective world with its opaque qualities and the objective body with its separate organs, the phenomenon of synesthetic experience is paradoxical. What does that mean, paradoxical? Hard to explain, hard to wrap your head around. It doesn't compute. So there's certain ways of looking at the world, certain ways of looking at your perceptual experience that the sort of thing that you just did in class doesn't make any sense. How can sight be sound, be taste, be, how can all these things mean each other? How can you look at that and say it's got spidery legs, you know, or say this looks hard, right? Or say the book, the pages look as if they would be soft to the touch, right? How are you able to do that? That's what synesthesia actually is. He says the attempt is made to explain it independently of the concept of sensation. So, you know, people think that you just, you know, turn it into a brain issue. And he says whether or not this explanation is supported by arguments drawn from brain physiology, this explanation doesn't account for synesthetic experience. For the subject doesn't say only that he has the sensation of both a sound and a color. Some people will hear a sound and it evokes a color. And I'm not just talking about somebody says blue and now you think about blue. I'm talking about, I say, ocean. Does the color blue sort of pop into your mind? You're having a synesthetic experience right there, right? The subject does not say only that he has the sensation both of the sound and the color. It's the sound itself that he sees when colors are formed. The formation is literally meaningless if vision is defined by the visual quale and sound by the acoustic. And so he's going on with this, and I'm going to skip over a little bit. He says, synesthetic perception is the rule, which means that whether you realize it or not, that's the way your brain actually works. You're having synesthetic experience all the time, you're just not conscious of it most of the time. It's lying below the threshold of your consciousness. Now, what does this have to do with you? Part of what you're going to be doing is you're training as chefs, is learning how to bring it above into your conscious dimension so that you can actually work with it, so that you can shape it, so that you can become better and better at predicting how it's going to pan out for people who you're creating dishes for. Because everybody's going through this. Everybody is seeing things which evoke sounds, which evoke tastes, which evoke smells, which evoke other units of meaning for them all the time. That's why you can look at, you know, you can look at a passageway and say, I don't want to go down there. And it says, why not? I don't know, it just looks scary. Really? How does it actually look scary? Well, it has that meaning. You know, does that mean that you just sort of like predict like a computer? There's a probability if I go down there I might get mugged. This looks like the kind of place where I might get mugged. No, what's going on is you actually perceive scariness out there in the world. And Merleau-Ponty is doing a kind of philosophical method that's called phenomenology, where you're being very attentive to our experience and how we put it together. Good chefs, whether they realize it or not, are actually also very good phenomenologists. They may not have read Merleau-Ponty, but they're doing sort of the thing that he's talking about here. So he says synesthetic perception is the rule, and we're unaware of it only because scientific knowledge shifts the center of gravity of experience. So we've unlearned how to see, hear, and generally speaking, feel. We've become kind of detached. And the more that we learn about the scientific way of looking at things, which is really a very abstract way of seeing things, the less we pay attention to what's actually in front of us and how it feels, how it sounds, how it smells. And so you guys are in the process now of learning how to pay more and more attention, right? That's part of what's going on in your classes. They have you taste things. They tell me what you're tasting. Why does it taste that way? How does it compare to other things? How would you replicate that? You know, and as time goes on, your palate's going to get more and more refined. That's you actually becoming more attentive to experience. So like he says, sight, it said, can only bring us colors or lights. I think he's right. You know, your eyeball, you guys know about how the science of your eyeball, right? What's in there? Besides, you know, goo and lenses and things like that. What's in the back? Do you remember from your classes?
Retina.
You got the retina and then...
Cornea.
Yeah, and that's letting light in. And what's that light actually hitting? Got those rods and cones in back there. And those are just like receptors. They're on, they're off. They're like your taste buds, right? How do your taste buds work? They're basically sort of on-off machines, aren't they? But that's not actual sense. That's not the meaning that you're experiencing. That's all that's going on with the organ, your eyeball. But is that, did any of you actually see little tiny pixels being put together? I hope not. If you do, you need to go to the doctor because there's something wrong with your brain. It's not actually wrong with your eyes. Your eyes are doing what they're supposed to be, but they're not being put together the right way, the information. So he says, sight, it said, can only bring us colors or lights, and with them forms, which are the outlines of colors, and movements, which are the patches of color changing position. That's all that, let's say that this was actually a really, really smart phone. It could make predictions about what people are doing and read faces and all that sort of stuff. All it'd be doing is taking in patches of color. That's all the camera can do. And the camera does that really well, better than your eye. But that's all it does. It doesn't generate meaning. How shall we place transparency or muddy colors in the scale? Muddy colors. If I say, this is kind of a muddy red, you understand what I'm saying, don't you? You can relate to it. That has meaning for you. Now, if all that was going on with your eyes was seeing just colors, that wouldn't make sense. Muddy is in a different realm. I guess maybe the realm of touch, isn't it? You guys know what mud feels like, don't you? You're transferring that meaning onto this surface, which you're taking in with your eyes. It says, in reality, each color in its innermost depths is nothing but the inner structure of the thing overtly revealed. The brilliance of gold, he talks about. The dull color of wood. That makes sense to you when I read that, doesn't it? You can picture that. But is wood really dull to the eye? It's dull to other things. You're transferring meaning. Meaning is bleeding over from one thing to another. He says the senses intercommunicate by opening up onto the structure of the thing. Now imagine that in terms of a dish. The things that you guys are talking about tonight. Your senses opening up onto the structure of the thing, making sense out of what it is. Now think about the taste of a beer, or when you bite into a piece of chicken, or what else we bring up. But yeah.
Are you talking about association?
Well, it is in part association, but the way in which the psychology of association has worked is it thought you just have a bunch of little bits and pieces and your mind just associates them together. Merleau-Ponty is talking about something going beyond that. It's not just a bunch of data that's all arranged in the right way, which evokes each other. You literally see in the wood the meaning of it, which includes that grain having a certain hardness to it, which you can only experience by actually touching it, right? He would say you're not just experiencing that through remembering, okay, I've gone and touched wood before. You could actually see things that you've never experienced and read into them meanings that they could have. When you look at certain dishes, have you ever looked at certain dishes and said, I'm not touching that. I'm not eating that. How did you know not to eat it? I mean, it could be that you actually ate that before. You're like, man, last time I ate that, terrible tasting, I better lay off of that. But there's some things you can look at and say, I've never, for example, eaten rotten meat that was so rotten that it had, flies or anything like that. But I don't actually need to have that experience to know that I wouldn't like that, and that it's probably going to taste awful, Yeah.
You talked about slippage as certain modalities get weaker because there is a slippage, right?
Oh.
So if there's a strong sense of smell in something, you tend not to like what it looks like, per se.
It depends on the smell, though, doesn't it?
Yes.
I mean, there's some smells that they might heighten your experience. You really enjoy them.
So, would you say there's a cap on all the modalities combined together?
Is there a cap on it?
Can you only experience certain level of modality before you?
Yeah, there are thresholds for we can only listen to sounds that are so loud before we're like, going crazy and we can't pay any attention to anything else. And if it's one continuous sound, it could probably be a bit louder than if it's like, jarring and like that at the same time. I guess there must be things like that with taste. Once you get beyond a certain hotness, I mean, for somebody like me, I'm not really good with super hot food. Once you get beyond a certain hotness, it's all just ungodly hot to me. Right? I don't have that sensation. And it's like that with visual things too. You guys perceive the world in brighter colors than I do, because I'm 42 years old, and my eyes are getting older, and you have that to look forward to yourself. So soak it up while you can, right? Look around as much as possible. Not so much at the computer screens, but at real life things. So yeah, there are certain thresholds, and when one of them is too high, it can keep us from being able to pay attention to other things. So let's move on now, and I'm going to talk about less about Merleau-Ponty and more about this guy Aristotle. So we're going far back in time, and I'm actually going to end up at the very end telling you a little bit about taste and the history of taste. So I'm throwing a little bone to you guys, you might say. Aristotle is interested in the way the senses work, in part because he's interested in everything. He is one of these kind of people who, and you'll see this, high performers in any field are generally not the people who are only interested in that field. They're interested in everything else too. They're interested in one thing in particular at that time, but they tie in everything else and they pay attention to everything else. Aristotle's like that himself, and he is focused in some of his works on the senses. So it looks like I have to wrap it up a little bit, get through this fairly quickly. So I'm going to skip over some of the things I was going to talk about. Aristotle is talking about the aesthesia part of this. We get the word aesthetics from this, aesthetically pleasing and things like that. And aesthesis is the Greek word for sense, or sensation, or perception. And you can contrast it to things like memory. When you're perceiving something right now, it's in front of you, you're perceiving it. Think about, the taste. We talked a lot about smoking and tobacco. Nobody's smoking right now, but you can remember what the taste is like, can't you? So that's different than sense perception. And I'll talk a little bit about time and memory if I have the time. Aristotle's interested in how do our senses work, and how do we put these things together? Is it just association, or are we actually, do these senses bleed into each other and complete themselves in a certain way? So he talks in a book called The De Anima, and I'll make a reading list. Dr. Shock asked me if I'd make a little reading list for you guys, so I'll make a lot kind of like reading recommendations about this. He talks about the different senses in the De Anima, which is about the soul. And he says a couple of interesting things. He says each sense has its own specific object. Okay, that makes perfect sense to you, right? What is taste about? You got to put things in your mouth and actually taste them. Smell is about odors. Sound is about, waves that you're getting through the air. Sight is about things that you're looking at. Each of them has its own modality, we would say, using the language that we did before. Now, he also says that touch is more differentiated than the others. And that makes sense, right? Heat and cold, we feel that through touch. Pressure, smoothness and roughness. This is pretty smooth. Do we have anything that's particularly rough around here? No, we don't, because it's a nice smooth classroom. But sandpaper would be rough, right? Your eyes only take in color. Your ears only take in sound. Taste, how many tastes are there? Basic tastes. 5, 6, yeah. Aristotle actually thinks there's 8. We'll talk about that in a moment. It's kind of an interesting question. How do we go from 8 down to 4 or 5 or 6? Aristotle also says we have specific senses, and then there's some things that are common sensibles. He thinks that we actually process in our mind, we process things and we bring them to a kind of unity. Your eyes and sight does not see a person as a person. It just sees colors. So how do you actually see, how many people we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 people sitting around, at a table. Did I count right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, good. Something more is going on than just your eyes. How do you perceive movement? Well, you're just seeing, Your eyes are only seeing colors changing. How do you actually perceive these things? Well, there's something that unites your senses together. And this is why it goes beyond just association of sense data. There's something that, in the very way in which you perceive things, ties things together in terms of what the different senses are providing to. So the senses also tie us together with pleasure and pain, aversion and things like that. And they form a unity, he says, in actual perception. The other thing that he says that I'm going to sort of skip ahead to, I guess I won't talk about memory or time or those sorts of things. Aristotle uses this word aesthesis in a broader sense in his works. In one of his books called The Politics, which is about political science, he was one of the founders of political science, he says that we're different than the other animals because we have perception of not just pain and pleasure, but what he calls moral qualities and aesthetic qualities. And what would these be? These would be things like right and wrong, just and unjust, noble and base, honorable and dishonorable. Aristotle actually uses the same word, aesthesis, perception, for those. And there's a lot more to be said about this, and I'm not going to say much more about this. But I think what's kind of interesting about him doing that is when you think about how you perceive things, how you look at the world, you don't just, things that are the moral qualities, good and bad, right and wrong, you don't just infer those. Those aren't just concepts. Those are things that you can actually see in people, in events, according to somebody like Aristotle. In actions. You can look at an action, like Merleau-Ponty talks, for example, about seeing somebody who's angry, and that anger is evident in the fist, or in the face, right? We make our angry faces, or the tone of the voice. You perceive that. If you're writing about that, some people would say, you're inferring too much. All you actually see is somebody, gripping their hand. There was this very naturalistic way of writing at one time where you weren't supposed to go beyond the pure, observation. Well, no, the way in which we actually do observe is, if I go like this, you're not just having a stimulus, response of, oh, I better get back. You perceive a threat, right? You perceive a threat. That's synesthesia working right now. Now imagine this again applied to dishes. Can dishes themselves be presented in a way that's slovenly or meticulously? When you see somebody presenting a dish meticulously, is that just a judgment on your part that has nothing to do with your senses? It's pure concepts? No, you actually perceive it. And part of becoming a chef is learning how to perceive these things better and better and better, so that you can decide the tricky cases. When is somebody being cool and slinging something out? When is somebody being a jerk? That's something that Aristotle would actually say. Maybe you can actually perceive that. Yeah.
So is Aristotle saying that moral qualities and aesthetics is something that you don't learn, but it's something in nature, a sense that you are born with?
No, you do learn it. You get better and better and better at it. And you can also learn it badly, so that your moral sense is all screwed up. Like you think that hurting people, just for the sake of hurting people is the best life possible, right? That person's screwed up. And you don't actually have to get a textbook of psychology and look through it and say, oh yeah, they fit the concept of the sociopath. You can actually look at people like that, and you actually feel the hairs on the back of your neck rising. You're like, stay away from that guy. We can go wrong in the way that we perceive things. That's a very good question. We can be trained to see things wrongly. We can misperceive. And we can, when we have fears, right? This is something I think all of you have to face as students. Part of your process of learning is learning how to recognize and overcome your fears that you have, that you didn't even realize that you had. And to not let those interfere with your process of paying attention to what's actually in front of you. That takes a lot of training, doesn't it? A kind of educative process. So this is about as far, I think, as will go. There's a lot more to be said about this. It's a very fascinating subject. So what I'd like you to take from this is this notion that when we're talking in sense language, it's quite okay to have these things bleed over into each other. That's the normal thing. That's what you're doing all the time. You're just doing it below the threshold of being conscious of it. Now you're actually trying to be conscious of it. And you're going to do that in your practice as chefs. You're going to do that. Any of you become food writers, you're going to do that. And you're probably going to do that in other fields that you go into as well. So, any questions? Any other questions? Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen the show Kyle XY.
So,
Kyle XY? Have you seen that?
no, I haven't.
He's like born practically at the age of 16, and like so he'll have like no experience.
Oh.
Like, so do you
Yeah.
think someone with no prior experience would see like a dark alleyway and they'd see fear, or they wouldn't see anything?
That's a good question. Aristotle would say, Aristotle actually talks about our need to experience things in part through touch to be able to figure out what they are. So if you'd never been in, were you going to say someone who's never been in that kind of situation? Well, instinct only explains the response. It doesn't explain the actual perception. Instinct is what you get after you're starting to perceive things. That's why a lot of times our instincts, which are pretty good, don't kick in when we need them to kick in, right? Yeah, I guess this Kyle XY guy would be kind of in a bad spot. Oh, I did promise that I would tell you about Aristotle and the eight tastes. Do you guys want to stay a couple of minutes and I'll tell you about this? It's kind of an interesting thing. So as I was looking through the De Anima, I hadn't realized this before. I knew that in the ancient world, they recognized more than 4 tastes. Because, we're used to thinking in terms of what? Sweet, salty, bitter, and sour, yeah. And then, we supplement that with spicy, perhaps, which is, barbs sticking into your tongue. And then, they've brought about umami, they talk about that. But for a long time, like it was back in the 50s, just before tastes. Now, John Damascene, who's writing much later than Aristotle, but who's still an early ancient guy, he talked about 8 tastes. And when I saw that, I was like, wait a second. Now, I know in Chinese cooking, there's the 5 tastes, and there's actually more, they recognize that. But where is this guy coming from? He's a Greek, writing back in, the ancient period. He's talking about 8 tastes? That's pretty differentiated. That's pretty sophisticated. And this guy is not a cook or a chef or even like a food procurer or anything. He's a philosopher. What does he know about taste, right? When I was reading Aristotle again today, just sort of prepping on this, I saw a passage in there where Aristotle's actually talking about 8 tastes. So what are they? He thinks that and he arranges them in kind of a strange way. He's got sweet and bitter as being like the 2 biggest tastes, the ones that are most opposed. And I have to go back to the Greek to figure out exactly what he's saying, because then he says, under sweet you also have succulent. That's what the translator translated it as. And under bitter you have salty. And bitter and salty we differentiate, right? Those are 2 completely different taste profiles. And then he says there's 4 in the middle. 4? Well, what are they? Well, he says there's astringent, acid. Acid, we know what that is, right? Sour. Pungent. And if we wanted to figure out what pungent means, we can look at the example that he gives, thyme. What would you say thyme, the herb, what would you associate that with? Savory, maybe?
Aromatic.
Aromatic, okay. So we could associate it with that. And then he says there's harsh and astringent. Astringent is probably something similar to numbing. What were those Chinese Szechuan peppers? Yeah, the sort of numbing, astringent, makes your mouth kind of curl up. They recognized that back in Aristotle's day. I don't know what they were eating that they recognized that. I haven't done that research yet. And then harsh is probably, I'm guessing in Greek, pikros, which means something like spicy. So they were recognizing 8 different tastes, all the way back in 4th century BC. And this is a guy who's not a cook. He's just a guy who likes to eat, apparently. And he was differentiating these. So think of what the cooks themselves must have been talking about. I'd really be interested in finding out how it went from recognizing 8 back down to only 4. Because that seems like an impoverishment. What is that?
Did they combine?
I don't know. Perhaps.
Well, succulent could be like honey.
Yeah. Although he uses honey as an example for sweet. So, yeah.